I'm still grappling with the chaos that took over my life last week. After moving to a new town, I decided to look for work and stopped by a small, seemingly deserted hotel on the shoreline to inquire about a front desk position. The hotel was dimly lit, and an unpleasant, stale smell filled the air. The man behind the desk had a thick accent that made communication difficult. The whole place felt off, but I pushed through, quickly filling out and submitting my application while feeling his unsettling gaze. Once I left, I regretted providing my personal information. That evening, as I was watching TV, I noticed a missed call from an unfamiliar number. It was late, and I was surprised by the call. I dialed the number back, and a woman with a heavy accent answered. Her response was confusing and alarming, and she ended the call abruptly after shouting something I couldn't fully understand. The mention of my name in her outburst made me uneasy, but I initially dismissed it as a wrong number or a prank. Just as I settled back into the living room, my phone rang again. This time the caller was the man from the hotel. His voice was loud and frantic, and I could hear the woman's voice in the background. The sounds were chaotic, and I only caught fragments of their words. The overall message was threatening, and I quickly ended the call. The phone continued to ring with calls from the same number, but I didn't answer. Thankfully, my phone lacked voicemail, so they couldn't leave any messages. When my husband arrived home around midnight, I shared the disturbing calls with him. He dismissed the situation, suggesting it was just a prank. Despite his nonchalant attitude, I felt a deep sense of fear. I had given personal information to these unsettling individuals, and now they were harassing me. I finally managed to fall asleep around 3 a.m., but my rest was short-lived. A half hour later, I woke up to my dog barking and growling aggressively at the back door. This behavior was completely out of character for her. My husband and I hurried to the living room and saw a hand reaching through the doggy door, scratching at the tiles. I screamed, and my husband quickly pulled me into the bedroom, locking the door behind us. I called the police, who arrived within 10 minutes. By the time they arrived, the intruder had disappeared, but I was certain it was the man from the hotel. I provided the police with my call log, but since the number was a prepaid phone, tracing it was difficult. The police left around 5:30 a.m., and I was too shaken to sleep. My husband and I decided to return to the hotel to gather more information. The manager informed us that the man I had described had been fired a year ago for stalking a housekeeper. It was chilling to learn that he had been hanging around the hotel and peering through windows. The security footage revealed that he had slipped in while the manager was away from the desk. The manager filed trespassing charges, and the police began searching for him. The realization that I had shared my personal details with someone who was now stalking me was overwhelming. As if things couldn't get worse, I discovered that my old boss had received a voicemail at 2 a.m., filled with heavy breathing and unsettling noises. The fear and anxiety have left me unable to sleep, and I jump at every phone call or the sound of my dog barking. A few years ago, I was working as a flight attendant and had decided to take a break from college. My job had taken me to many unusual places, but one experience still haunts me. I grew up in Texas but had moved to New York when I was 21. When I found out I'd have a few overnights in Austin for a week-long trip, I was thrilled. I planned to catch up with my brother, who lived just north of the city, and meet up with my dad the next day. I arrived at the downtown hotel and checked in with my crew. We went our separate ways to our rooms. After a brief elevator ride, I reached mine. It was early afternoon, around 1 or 2 p.m. I had just started to relax when a loud, urgent knock jolted me upright. I hadn't contacted my family yet, so they wouldn't have known which room I was in. I assumed it was one of my crewmates, but as I approached the door, a deep, commanding voice came through. He claimed to be sent by the front desk about a bathroom issue I hadn't reported. He insisted he needed to get in. I was instantly on alert. I hadn't called about any problem with the bathroom. I peered through the peephole and saw a tall, broad man His eyes were unsettling, dark and cold. There was no way I was opening the door. I told him he must have the wrong room. He didn't stop. His pounding grew louder and more frantic, his voice demanding entry. I grabbed the phone and called the front desk. The clerk's response was unnerving. They hadn't sent anyone to my room and had no record of any bathroom issue. As I talked to the clerk, I noticed the man outside had gone quiet. My anxiety spiked. I heard him pacing, then the sudden sound of a metal object scraping against the doorframe. I could only imagine what he was trying to do. The elevator dinged, and I heard the security officers arrive. Their voices were calm at first, but then I heard a commotion. The man's voice became a fierce growl, yelling about how he'd been waiting for me. I heard a crash, followed by heavy footsteps. The officers were struggling with him, their shouts becoming more frantic. The front desk clerk told me the police were on their way. My dread grew as I listened to the man's enraged shouts. The sound of splintering wood grew louder as he tried to force his way into my room. My heart raced, and I backed away from the door, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. When the police finally arrived, their voices were sharp and authoritative, but the chaos outside only intensified. I heard the man's threats growing louder, his demands more violent. The officers' voices grew strained, and suddenly there was a deafening crash followed by silence. My door was still locked, but I could hear footsteps approaching from the hallway. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. It felt as though the hallway had swallowed the chaos. My heart pounded as I waited. Moments later, I heard the sound of the door being unlocked. It wasn't the police. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open. I braced myself for the worst. Just as I was about to call out, a figure slipped into my room. My vision adjusted to reveal the man from earlier, his eyes glinting with a malevolent satisfaction. I was paralyzed with fear. The police had failed to secure the area properly. The man had somehow evaded them and was now standing in my room, closing the door behind him. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way to escape or defend myself. Just as he began to advance, there was a sudden, loud bang against the door. The police had returned. I could hear their voices shouting as they forced their way back in. The man's expression changed from one of triumph to panic. He tried to flee, but the police burst in just in time. The man was apprehended once more, and the officers quickly ensured my safety. They assured me that the situation was under control, but the realization that the police had almost failed me left me shaken. The experience was a grim reminder of how close I had come to a far worse outcome. The rest of my stay at the hotel was filled with a lingering sense of dread. Even though nothing else happened, the terror of that day stayed with me, casting a long shadow over what should have been a pleasant trip. I had just settled into my new job at a popular hotel in the snowy town of Frisco, Colorado. It was my first winter in the States, and everything was new and exciting. I had moved from South America to work and travel during the summer, and I was thrilled to experience snow for the first time. I wasn't sure what my exact role at the hotel would be, but I was eager to find out. The owner, a tall Ukrainian-American man in his mid-40s, met me when I arrived. His intense gaze made me a bit uneasy, but he introduced me to my duties. I was to work as a hostess in the hotel's restaurant and deliver room service orders. I hadn't expected to be on the front lines with guests, especially since my English wasn't perfect. Despite my reservations, he was adamant that I take on the role. The ski season in Colorado is notoriously busy, and the hotel was no exception. The restaurant was packed with visitors from all over the world. My language barrier led to frequent mistakes, and the owner's frustration was palpable. One time, a coworker of mine was taking longer than usual to clean a table, and the owner, clearly agitated, snatched the towel from her hand and threw it at her. His anger was directed at both of us, and his harsh words left me feeling humiliated and small. Despite this, he would act friendly after hours, buying drinks at the bar and making uncomfortable comments about my appearance. His touches were unwelcome and invasive. New Year's Eve brought a startling incident at the hostel where I was staying. I was out with friends that night, but I later learned that one of the hostel's residents had been high on drugs and had chased a friend of mine through the building, threatening him with a gun. The police arrested the man, but the atmosphere at the hostel turned tense and fearful. The next day, while discussing the frightening event with a co-worker, the hotel owner overheard and offered me a room at the hotel for the next 2 weeks. He said it was due to the hostel's current safety issues. I was relieved by his offer, especially as it meant a private space away from the noisy hostel dormitory. The first few nights in the hotel were a welcome change. I felt a sense of relief and privacy that I hadn't had before. But that sense of security quickly turned into dread. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I went to bed exhausted. I woke up around 2 a.m. disoriented and noticed that my room door was ajar. The hallway lights cast a faint glow into the room. Then, I saw a silhouette, a tall figure, standing just inside my doorway. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was watching me. I heard a metallic clinking sound, as if the person was fiddling with a belt. My mind raced, and I panicked. I shouted out, but the figure quickly retreated. The next morning, I reported the incident to my co-workers and the hotel management. They brushed it off as a possible mistake by housekeeping or a figment of my imagination. I found it hard to believe that someone could mistakenly enter my room at such an hour. The owner, who had previously been so attentive, now ignored me completely. Days turned into weeks, and I moved on with my life, finding a new job and a new apartment. A year later, while scanning the local Summit Daily News, I was stunned to see the hotel owner's face on the front page. He had been arrested for entering the rooms of 2 female guests after getting them drunk at the bar. They had woken up to find him standing in their room, preparing to assault them. The police had been called, and he was apprehended. The thought of it being him in my room that night makes me shudder. I'm almost certain it was him, though I never confirmed it. What haunts me most is the possibility that it might have happened before. There were nights when I drank more than I should have, and I sometimes woke up with no memory of the previous night. It's unsettling to think that this could have been a recurring nightmare for me, and perhaps for others who stayed there. The mystery of that night remains with me, a chilling reminder of the darker side of human nature and the importance of feeling safe wherever we lay our heads. I'd been traveling through Eastern Europe for 6 weeks, trying to shake off the fog of grief after my little brother's death. Nothing seemed to work, and worry about my parents and what was happening back home gnawed at me. By the time I reached Slovakia, I was ready to throw in the towel. I had a flight booked out of Bratislava in a week, so I had no choice but to see the trip through. When I got to the city, I set out to find my hostel. I had done my homework. I read reviews, called for details, and got first-hand accounts from other travelers. I researched more for this trip than I did during my 3 years at university, but in the end, no amount of research can replace instinct. When I arrived at the hostel and felt a shiver run through me, I decided to forfeit my deposit and leave. Finding a place to stay at night on short notice in Bratislava was a challenge. I started in the city center, where crowds and streetlights made the area seem bustling and safe. After being turned away repeatedly, I ventured further from the city center, where the streets were darker and emptier. Eventually, I stumbled upon a hostel hidden away at the end of an alley. It lacked any sign advertising rooms, but hostel was painted on the front. The door was locked, but after knocking, an elderly woman answered. She finally let me in after some convincing. The hostel had been closed for a couple of years due to her daughter's illness. Now, only one other couple was staying there, having arrived lost and desperate. The woman handed me a set of keys and warned me about thin walls that let everyone hear each other. My room was small and grimy, with a desk, curtains, a wardrobe, and a bed pushed up against the wall. I was unsettled knowing my head would be so close to whoever was next door. That night, as soon as I lay down, I heard voices from the adjacent room. One was a deep male voice, and the other was a younger voice. Their argument was faint, but unmistakable. The next day I explored Bratislava, marveling at its ancient architecture. I visited the Bratislava City Museum, Esterházy Palace, and Kunovo Waterworks. I learned about a tragic shooting from 2010 involving a 15-year-old boy who killed 4 women. As the day ended, I felt a deep sense of loneliness. I contemplated calling home but reminded myself that the purpose of this trip was to clear my mind. The ache in my chest yearned for familiarity and comfort. As I walked back to the hostel, a girl with dirty blonde hair caught my eye. Her intense gaze locked onto mine, and before I could react, she vanished into the crowd. That night I turned off the lamp and tried to ignore the bickering next door. The argument grew more intense, with the deep voice dominating and bullying the younger one. I was relieved I hadn't met them yet. The man's voice alone was enough to unsettle me. I tried to focus on sleep, but the argument and occasional giggles from the young voice kept me on edge. I ended up propping a cabinet against my door, spending the night in short, uneasy bursts of sleep. The following morning, I asked the landlady about the couple next door. She told me to respect the privacy of her guests, and when I pressed further, she warned me to drop the matter or leave. I almost took her up on it. The lack of sleep took its toll. I walked around Bratislava exhausted, relying on coffee and cigarettes. I fell asleep during tours and ended up with blurry photographs. On my last night, I went to bed with a pounding headache. As soon as I lay down, the argument next door started up again. This time, the deep voice spewed obscene insults, bullying the woman and calling her degrading names. Crashing sounds and the woman's screams filled the night. I pressed my ear against the wall, heart racing, until a thunderous thump shook my room. I had to do something. I bolted into the hallway and knocked on their door, but the argument continued unabated. A hand on my shoulder startled me. It was the landlady, and I nearly shoved her down the stairs in my panic. The landlady urged me to go to bed, but I insisted that I thought someone was being hurt. Her insistence that I go back to my room only made my anxiety worse. I pounded on the door again, but the argument raged on inside. Desperate, I took a breath and slammed my shoulder into the door, forcing it open. The sudden silence inside was deafening. I stepped into the room and was immediately disoriented by what I saw. A girl with unkempt blonde hair lay in the bed, her wrists bound to the posts with rope. Her eyes snapped open, and she gave a deep, unsettling laugh. She stared at me and in a man's voice said my name. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside.